This is not disposable. We can't use this and move on. It's not like there's another Yakima Valley down there where you can just plant new grapes. I mean, this is one of the great places in the world to grow wine grapes.
So it has to be maintained sustainably.
Yeah.
To not be lost.
Exactly.
This is the Real Food, Real People podcast.
Is wine sustainable? Well, here in Washington State, it's potentially more sustainable to grow grapes and make them into wine than anywhere in the world. And our guest this week explains why. He shares his story of how he became a winemaker and has devoted his life to the art and craft of creating wines. And he talks about what is probably one of the most under-recognized wine growing regions on the West Coast or beyond. Right here in Washington State, we talk with Co Dinn Cellars. He makes wine in Sunnyside, Washington. We go right into his tasting room to have the conversation this week. I'm Dylan Honkoop. This is the Real Food, Real People podcast. Glad you are here with us for this conversation and our conversations every week, showing the real people behind our food and reconnecting our food system to where our food really comes from here in Washington State. Manna Insurance Group is one of our sponsors making this all possible. We thank them. MannaInsuranceGroup.com is their website. And as I've said many times before, their whole philosophy is about planning ahead, not just waiting for things to go wrong. Also, Dairy Farmers of Washington, wadairy.org is their website. They tell a lot of stories themselves about Washington dairy farmers and the stories behind the dairy products we enjoy here in Washington State and that are made here in Washington State and then enjoyed all over the world. So check them out again as well at wadairy.org. You have a pretty incredible story that led you to this point here. How did you become a winemaker and be a part of this world? Where did this start for you?
It's funny. I grew up in Texas and around the country. My dad worked for an oil company, Texaco. And so, I kind of I grew up in Texas and I gravitated towards that and ended up working in the oil industry in Oklahoma. And I realized that after about a year and a half that it was absolutely not what I wanted to do. And I did a hard reset. I kind of said, this is before computers, but I basically rebooted and stopped, moved back to Texas from Oklahoma and really thought about what it was that I really wanted to spend my life doing.
Yeah.
Rather than carrying on the family tradition. And it was, it took a while. But I realized I had started enjoying wine when I was in Oklahoma. And I started thinking about it, and I thought, I could do that. That would be fun. And I looked into it and found out what was involved with becoming a winemaker. And it really involved moving out west. And I had been out west. I had traveled after college. I'd taken a motorcycle trip out west, and I just fell in love with the western half of the country. And at the time, I hadn't thought about it, but I had remember saying to myself, "I'll be back," And so I ended up moving out west to study winemaking at UC Davis in California. That was where you went at the time, back in the early 90s. And ended up getting a job in California, in Napa, and I worked in Napa from 89 through 96. And in 96, I was recruited up to Washington to make wine up here. And it was kind of easy for me to decide to do that because it was a new, well, first of all, I wasn't from California. I mean, California is wonderful, but I wasn't held by family or anything like that. So, and in fact, my sister at the time was living in Seattle. And so I thought, I'll be closer to family. It's a great opportunity. And so I moved up here in 1996 to make white wine for a larger winery called Co Dinn Cellars, and then eventually became the head winemaker there and ended up working at Hogue for 17 years.
Wow.
But ultimately, I decided I wanted to do more traditional artisanal type winemaking, and so I worked my way in that direction. And in 2013, I was able to break off on my own and start my own winery.
And that's here in Sunnyside.
Yes.
Why Sunnyside?
Well, it's funny. I settled here in the Yakima Valley, and the Yakima Valley grows about half of the grapes in the state. It's really kind of the it has this great combination of volume and diversity and small farms as well as smaller growers. A lot you get into some of the outlying regions and they're bigger farms and down in the Horse Heavens or on the Wallach Slope, and so having that diversity we have both a diversity of climate as well as growers and sites, and it's big enough that you can pretty much find exactly what you're looking for. And many of the best wineries in the state do just that. They're not just necessarily here, but many of the top wines in the state are sourced exclusively from the Yakima Valley. Really? So, I mean, I knew all this as an insider, having worked here, and
even though Yakima Valley isn't like a brand like you mentioned, the Horse Heaven Hills, anybody around the state and beyond in the region and maybe even farther know that brand really.
Yeah,
but they don't know Yakima Valley,
and that's something we're working to change too. We have the Wine Yakima Valley, which is our marketing organization, and it's a unique area because we do supply so many. Grapes go to Seattle, to Woodinville, Puget Sound. They go to Oregon. They go to Walla Walla. They go to Chelan. The grapes from the Yakima Valley are in wines from all over the state.
Yeah, and
there are some of those wineries' best wines as well. So for a variety of reasons, it's if you're in Napa, well, you have to have your wines be called Napa. They have to be made in Napa, and the wineries are there inside that little area, and it's almost the inverse here, where so many of our grapes go everywhere. And we have 3 sub-appellations as well. We have Red Mountain, Snipes Mountain, and the Rattlesnake Hills, and Candy Mountain now as well, 4 sub-appellations. So it's a big area, it's very diverse, and we had settled here in Sunnyside, and actually now in Granger, which is about 10 miles away. So we're very happy living here in the middle of the Yakima Valley. Lots of friends and colleagues here. I know all the back roads and vineyards like the back of my hand. And so for me, this is where I've settled. This is where I've planted my flag, really. And it's easy to get almost anywhere from here. It's easy to get here from almost anywhere. I mean, it's
centrally located.
Yeah, it's just perfect for me. And so since I'd been in Sunnyside and in the very close vicinity for 25 years now, at the time it had been about 17, it was just natural for me. And so it was also fresh ground too. In a way, there's 2 wineries in the town now: Cote Bonneville and Co Dinn Cellars. So it was not like I'd be the 14th or 25th winery in the little area.
Right.
So basically, it was my community, and this is where I wanted to put down my roots.
What was it like making that move from doing it for others and saying, I'm going to have my own brand, I'm going to have my own winery, this is my baby now?
Well, the great thing about working as a professional winemaker is that you get to, you work your way up through the stages. That's the hardest thing to do in terms of, if you're not born into a winemaking family, is to get, it's such a craft. And in my opinion, you really need to start at the bottom and work your way up through the ranks and learn each step as you go through. And you got to learn the vineyards, and it just takes a long time. And you can make wine by deciding you're going to make wine and calling up a grower and saying, deliver me a ton of grapes and I'm going to make wine out of them. But if you're really trying to reflect not only the region, but the techniques that have been accepted and developed over the millennia, you need to kind of grow up in it. And either you can do that because your grandfather and your father and now you, or your grandmother and your mother, you know, or you can work your way up through in a career. But in winemaking, you have to kind of plot your course because there's so many different ways you can go about it. And at a point, probably 7 years before I started my winery, I realized that's where I wanted to end up going. And I had to start plotting how, my direction in that direction, so that when the time came that I was able to break away, I could. And I put all the pieces in place so that could happen. But I was glad. I think I didn't do it too soon for a variety of reasons. I'm glad I waited, but I'm glad I didn't wait any longer either, because it takes a long time too. Yeah. From the time you start to the time you have wine in the bottle to the time that you get, you start developing the notoriety for those wines, et cetera. It's just
how do you develop that following and people recognizing the brands? Because you can make amazing wines, but if nobody knows about them, it is a crowded market space getting to be, as wine has become so much more popular in the last couple of decades.
Well, it is.
You have to differentiate yourself somehow.
Well, and wine, the thing is, wine is if not the most, one of the most niche type of products, bar none. I mean, everything from $2 chuck to $10,000 bottles of trophy wine or whatever. I mean, it just goes, and everything in between. And so you realize that you actually have to define what you're doing, define who your consumer is and customers are, and then target them specifically. And it may be that you're making 1 million cases a year and you're targeting major grocery brands,
right? Or
it could be that you're making 50,000 cases a year and you're targeting restaurants at a certain price point. Or in my case, I'm a very small. I focus on vineyard-designated, single vineyard wines from this wonderful region, the Yakima Valley. And I work primarily direct-to-consumer, and I have small accounts and things like that. But it's and I do for the last year and a half, everything myself. So it's a one-person operation. So I'm kind of at the small end of the spectrum. Yeah. But I also have a lot of connections within the industry and within whether that's, the production, the winemaking part, the academic part, the media, et cetera. And it's just, you just have to network just like everybody does, and expand your network and focus and that kind of thing. So that's how I've done it.
You said that you do kind of more of a traditional approach to your winemaking. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? And what are your wines like as a result of that?
Well, so, winemaking and wines have, obviously go way back, thousands of years. And there's been this continuum from the first prehistoric person who realized that this was a good thing. Yeah. Up through through the Romans and the Greeks and the Romans, and then into the Thomas Jefferson. I mean, even back. Yeah. And all of this time, there's been a relative consensus. Wherever you are, these are the grapes that grow well here. These are how we make these wines in our area, and there's a tradition and a technique, and we add to it and we learn more. But it's a continuum, and within that continuum, there are recognized there are contextual clues and things that we know about, and we can relate. How do I relate my wine to this other wine over here, to this wine that was made 50 years ago? And that really, if you're just talking about wine that you go, in a can that you're picking up at the convenience store, that's kind of not, there may be a little bit of that, but when you're talking about fine wine, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context of other wines that are being made and that have been made in the past. And you can say, I'm going to be I'm going to be a wild child, and I'm going to make a blend of Gewürztraminer and Cabernet Sauvignon, which is like, no one does that. And there's a good reason people don't do that very often.
Right.
If unless they make a mistake in the winery. It's been known to happen. But that's because we found people before us and the people we know and the people that we've wines that we've had have done a lot of experimentation over the years, and we know these flavors work well together, and these techniques work well. And so I'm belaboring a point, but there's a good reason to give your customer a context to relate to.
Yeah.
So if they're looking at a Co Dinn wine that's a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Bordeaux style blend that's made of the varieties that traditionally go into Bordeaux style wines, which include Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot and often, on occasion Malbec and these kind of wines, then there's a context for them to say, oh, okay, this is really good, and it tastes kind of like this other wine that I liked that was a Bordeaux, or it's better than that one that I had before in this style.
Yeah.
And it has a certain type of oak aging profile that makes it comparable and relatable. So these are important for people who are into or relate to wine and want to learn more about it. And beers are the same way. It's a stout. It's a IPA. It's a Northwest IPA. It's a Northeast IPA. It's whatever, but it fits within a context. It's a hazy Northwest IPA. But it always, and you can make these things that nobody understands or has ever seen before. But in general, those are very small because most consumers are looking for, for something they can latch onto in a contextual fashion. So, but within those constraints, there's a world of, of variety and innovation and stylistic things you can do. And they're just the guardrail. It's kind of like the guardrail. So in my mind, the reason I respect the tradition that's come before me, and I want to, hew to it to the extent that I can. I'll do, if there's new technology that I feel is beneficial, I'll utilize it. For instance, I use Stelvin twist-off screw caps for my wines, only because I've done years and decades of research that showed me that they are not only, they preserve the wine more consistently, and there's less bottle-to-bottle variation. There's never a problem with the corks, and they actually age better, as well as or better than a natural cork. Mm-hmm. So I've made that conversion, and that may sound...
Isn't there generally a move away from natural cork because of the problems that it can have?
There are more options now. The natural cork is just so for over 100 years, maybe actually several hundred years, it's been the closure of choice. Yeah. Before we had anything else, and it works great. There's variability amongst corks, and there can be off flavors associated with them. And, so it's only been in the last 60 years that we've really seen alternatives to corks. And the alternative that I use was developed in the mid-'60s. The screw cap is new because it's not 200 years old, right. But it's been around, and it's been very well researched. And in terms of physically working, it's been established. In fact, the industries of New Zealand, Australia, and Switzerland all are 99% screw caps. fact, that the only corks they use are ones they ship to America for the most part. But it's actually a conservative choice when it comes to something we know that works really well.
Yeah.
And then it boils down to consumer education and saying, I use this because it makes my wine better.
It's not lower class because it's a screw cap.
No, it's and there's some people who are very, very traditional and they just don't want anything but a cork, and that's fine. Like I said, there's a consumer for every wine, and there's a wine for every consumer. So, but I do not. The work I've done shows that there's only benefits to the wine quality for the type of the type of closure that I use on my bottles.
So what are your wines? What kind of wines do you do?
So the wines I make are, I make a Chardonnay, a traditionally styled barrel fermented Chardonnay. I press the grapes, the juice goes into the barrel, it ferments there, it goes through a secondary fermentation, and then it settles. There's winemaking that goes on, stirring and topping and things like that, but basically after I wait for 17 months to pass, and the wine settles, and then I bottle it unfiltered. So it's an unfiltered white wine.
Wow.
It's when done well, it's a traditional style, it has traditional flavors and complexity, and you're able to bottle it without any filtration. The same for my red wine. So that's the white wine I make. Mm-hmm. I do a Southern Rhone style red, which is Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, a blend. We call it GSM, but it's a traditional Southern Rhone style blended wine, and it's a medium-bodied red with really nice cherry fruit and spice and little peppery characters, and it's a great food wine. It's aged in oak barrels, but they're neutral barrels, so it doesn't have really any oak flavors in it. Then I do a Cabernet Sauvignon, which is from a specific vineyard called the Painted Hills Vineyard, and it is 85% Cabernet with the remainder a blend of Petit Verdot and Malbec. I do a couple of Syrahs, one from Snipes Mountain, which grows in gravel. Here's some of the rocks from Snipes Mountain. Wow, they're really cool. And then then another from Elephant Mountain Vineyard, which is the highest elevation vineyard in the Yakima AVA. And then I do a red Bordeaux style blend from Elephant Mountain, which is about 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, 20% Merlot, and the remainder of Malbec, Cabernet Franc, and Petit Verdot. So it's a Bordeaux style blended wine. That's not a majority. It's a majority of Cabernet, but not as much as the Cabernet Sauvignon that I make. So, and again, that's from Elephant Mountain, which to my mind is, if not in the state, one of the greatest vineyards in the Yakima Valley. In my mind, the state as well. So and these vineyards, I mean, you asked me why I'm in the Yakima Valley. Part of it is there are great vineyards all throughout the state. Wonderful. But I'm only one person, and there's so much to work with here. You can't have it all. I mean, you can. I suppose you can. But I like being able to go have proximity to the vineyards. I can get out there whenever I need to talk to the grower, to see how the grapes are doing, And proximity for me means that I'll be there more often, and that can only be good for a winemaker, to be in the vineyard as much as possible.
So what's the basic process as you do it to make wine? Obviously, we're right around harvest time right now, right? Like the grapes are being harvested, and that's when you get them, right? Yeah, so basically, different grapes ripen at different times. So, and it's like apples or any fruit. You have different varieties, and they have windows when there's earlier ripening varieties and middle and later, and then it depends on your site, as a warm site or a cool site. I mean, a warm site with a late variety might ripen the same as a cool site with an early variety, kind of a thing. Right. So, but in general, after having worked with these vineyards for
25 years, I know what to expect. And honestly, Eastern Washington is one of the most consistent, predictable agricultural regions in the world in terms of it's almost boringly consistent. And I mean that in the best possible way. Yeah. There's no surprises ever, or very seldom are there any surprises. And even the surprises aren't that bad. So it's pretty much, I know when things are going to come in. And so, for instance, I know when the Chardonnay is getting close. We'll pick the Chardonnay. I'll wait until it's close to being picked. I'll be out there sampling, tasting, and looking at the sugar numbers and the flavors. And then I'll schedule the grapes, send the bins out to the field. And then the farmer will pick them in the morning when it's cool. I'll go out with my trailer, pick up the bins, and bring them back here. And basically, I have a forklift that picks them up and dumps them directly into the press. Yeah. Squeeze the juice out into a tank and let it settle overnight, and then pump it into the barrels the next day. And then it never comes out from that barrel until 2 years, a year and a half later. So that's the process for crushing, picking and crushing the Chardonnay. And for my purposes, the grapes are all hand-picked. Machine picking works, but for the small amounts that I get, it's actually easier for them to go out and pick them. Yeah. And for the reds, basically the sampling and the decision-making is the same, and then the grapes are picked. I bring them in, and then I ferment in 1-ton bins, and the bins are made of a food-grade polyethylene. They're very neutral. I've had the same bins for 15 years or 10 years, whatever it's been, and they're just like a milk carton or something. It's just a real neutral, easily cleanable vessel. And the grapes go into that. I put the grapes under a crusher, and I crush the grapes and destem them into this bin, and they ferment in the bin. I use a very traditional yeast for fermenting the grapes that I've worked with for many years, and I know works. It makes the best wine most consistently. I mean, really, I don't do much experimentation anymore because I did all of that earlier in my career. Right. And found what worked and what worked for me, and which is predictable. And makes great wine. It has
and those probably define your signature style.
What's interesting. Too. What's interesting is that it's kind of like what I found is there are when it comes to deciding about yeasts and fermentation is you find out which one works the most consistently, the best. It makes the best wine most consistently. Because if you work at a big place, you can experiment. Because if you have any things that don't work, you can just make them disappear. But when you work in a small place where you have to get, you may have 3 different batches, they all have to be good. Yeah. And so that's for me, I can't make something disappear. I have to make it good. And so fortunately, I figure that out. And that was, and a lot of it was being responsible for millions and millions of dollars worth of wine that had to be good every year. Right. And so that, I don't have any, I've made all the mistakes you can make already, and so I figured out how to not make them here, which is great, which makes it, that's really important. So it makes it possible for me to do this. But, so the reds, they crushed into into the bin where they start fermenting. And then for reds, this is really key, is getting the fermentation, knowing how to get the flavors and the color and the tannins out of the skins is really important. And part of it's the temperature you ferment at, and also when you press the skins away from the wine. And depending on where the grapes are grown and how they're grown and how you ferment them, that could be sooner or later. But what you're really looking for is getting good stuff out of the grapes, but not too much in terms of tannins. So tannins are the best grapes have a lot of tannins, the red grapes. And in general, I can make in general, the best grapes have lots of color and lots of tannins. And so, in fact, for the best grapes that I get, you can actually get too much tannin if you're not careful. Fortunately, all the color comes out first, and the tannins take a little longer. But once you get up to the right amount, then you put it all in a press and separate the skins and seeds from the wine. And but if you do that all right, and you've optimized the temperature of the fermentation, and you've pressed it at the right time, then the wine finishes fermenting. And once it's through, I just press it back into another empty bin, and then it ferments there for a few days, and then goes into barrels. And so the wine goes into barrels as soon as it stops, as soon as there's no sugar left in it. It goes into barrels, and then it goes to the secondary fermentation in the barrels, and then it stays there. And we'll pump it out and blend it and do things like that from time to time, and that's part of the clarification process. But if everything's done properly, then it can be bottled and filtered at the end of the process, which is about 22 months.
What's your favorite wine that you're most proud of making over the years? Like what year and what varietal?
It's funny. It's like I get this question. I've gotten it all through my career. I've gotten it in job interviews. What's the best, greatest wine you ever tasted? And things like that. And the way I have to, it's almost like asking someone, a chef, what's the best plate of food he ever made for anybody?
Yeah.
Or that he ever ate himself. And it's like, well, I've eaten thousands and thousands of plates of food that were really good, and I've made thousands and thousands of wines that, it's like, it's hard, once you do this, like I've been doing it for so many years, it's not so much any particular, I'd like to say it's not a cop-out, and maybe it is.
Well, what if I turned it around on you? What was the worst one you ever made? Do you have a total bomb ever?
The key is, I've made, the worst wine I ever made. This is good. I do have that. And this is a great story because it was when I was first getting into wine. And I believed that, like, there's, I was working in Napa, and we had the winery I worked for had Pinot Noir growing that was not any very good site. And it was, and so because it wasn't a very good site, it would make this thing called second crop, which is extra grapes that grow later in the season that you don't want. Mm-hmm. But they would ripen eventually, but they're not good. It's like the main crop wasn't that good, and the second crop wasn't good either.
Even worse.
So, but they let us pick it. So I'm brand new, and everything's exciting. So we picked these grapes, and I had this old barrel I bought from. It was just an old barrel that no one wanted. It was a 30-gallon barrel. It was half size. So, and then we crushed the grapes, and we made the wine, and I didn't have where to store it, so I put it in my garage where it was, 100 degrees or whatever. And everything was wrong about this. Yeah. But it tastes, I was young and new to the industry, and I made it, so it must be good, And
ooh, I made a wine.
So I bottled some up, and I took it into my boss at the winery I worked at. And this is a professional, no-nonsense, wonderful man named John Cole, who was really one of my first serious mentors in the industry. And I said, I'd like you to try my wine. And he said, sure. I poured him a glass. And he told me that in words that I can't say on a podcast, that it wasn't any good. He said it very matter-of-factly, what he thought of it. And I was crestfallen.
Yeah.
But then, he's like, how did you make this? And I started thinking about what I did. And everything I did contributed to it not being a good wine, and it was a great learning experience. And the most important thing is that just because I made it didn't mean it was good. Yeah. And every winemaker needs to have that epiphany, at some point, hopefully earlier in the process. And so you talk to a lot, it's interesting. You talk to artists or musicians and you ask them about their best performance. And the amazing thing that sticks out to me is when you ask them about a specific performance, they go, oh, I missed that note on, in the third bar of the second chorus or something. And that may be your favorite solo ever.
Yeah.
But
Right.
they're still picking it apart as a professional, and it's like, at one point it becomes, how good is your body of work? What are the high
Right.
points? What are those things, that's when you do this as a career, it's too hard to keep track of all those little things. And
Like having one good game versus winning the championship. They're two different things.
yes, yeah. I mean, there's some great games in there. There were some really exciting moments, but they pale in comparison to the bigger picture, which is, how have you performed over the long haul? What have you accomplished? What big things have you accomplished? So to me, I've made some great wines. And the funny thing is, I have wines that get, I send in one wine to the critics. You send it to 4 different critics, and one critic gives it the highest score you've ever gotten, 94 points, 96 points. The other critic gives it 88. Like, if you ask those two, one of them may say that was the best wine I ever had, and the other one may say meh. So it's like, you kind of step back and you go, like, I know I make good wines, and I know objectively what makes a great wine. I mean, you could pick it apart analytically, like, well, it's concentration of these characteristics, it's lack of flaws, it's elements of complexity that are formed by these things that I know about and that I've learned how to do, and all in balance with each other, and not, no elbows sticking out, no, smooth, easy to drink, blah, 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 blah. I mean,
But even back to what you were talking about earlier about the relativity, like the context and the other wines that are similar and the history and all of that, it's never going to be an objective.
It can't be. So there's always a mystery.
Analysis,
And that's actually what makes it interesting and exciting, is the mystery and the fact that it's always changing. And it's not even what's the best wine I ever made, it's which bottle did I drink at the perfect time in its aging process? Perfect for me. Because perfect for me may be different from someone who likes more age on their wine.
Yeah.
So I don't try to keep track of that. I just enjoy doing this and being here and doing my best and trying to contribute to the industry and in my region and not worry about those things. So, I mean, it's an important question so that I can give you that answer, because I get the question often. And I've probably lost the job that I interviewed for, where the guy said, what was your favorite wine? I said, honestly, I'm a winemaking professional. It's like, I don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you I'll make you great wines. It's like, that's not what he wanted to hear.
Yeah.
But he's not a winemaker. He wasn't a winemaker either. So it was...
You wouldn't understand that.
It was a bad answer if I wanted to get the job, but I don't, Conversely, I really, if he didn't want me for that answer, then he got someone else. He didn't want me anyway.
It'd be the wrong fit.
It wouldn't have been a good fit. So, I mean, I answered it the way that makes the most sense for me.
How sustainable is winemaking, and particularly here in Washington State? And what kind of things do you do with a focus on sustainability?
Well, I love our region because I would say it's probably in terms of existing wine growing regions where there's already stuff growing. Now, like, if you have to go somewhere and dig up a native plant and plant wine grapes, that's, you could have a whole other argument about why are we doing this?
Right.
But considering we're in an agricultural area that's been making, growing orchards and vineyards for over 100 years, whether that's in Washington or France or in California or South America, or Australia or wherever, I would say that our region is among the most sustainable in terms of inputs we have to do to and effect on the environment. So if you think about, the wine grape is a plant that in its native environment, it grows up in a tree, it covers a tree, and berries form and birds eat them and fly off and spread the seeds around.
Yeah.
And that's not how a wine grape grows in a vineyard. A vineyard grows. When a vine's up a tree, it's spread out. It's stressed. It's not constrained, and it grows naturally. And nothing's. You don't have to feed it. You don't have to spray it. You don't have to do anything. Well, when you put a wine in a vineyard, a grapevine in a vineyard, all of a sudden you're changing it and you're making it so that, okay, now because the vine it's being put in a small area and now it's more prone to have a higher humidity environment, and now it might have fungus. And now there's a bunch of them all together and they might get attacked by insects. And so what are we going to do about this?
The monocropping problem.
Yeah, since it's not one vine growing in a tree in a field somewhere, it's 1,000 vines growing in an acre with nothing else other than cover crop growing there. It's now susceptible to attack by pathogens and disease, viruses and bacteria and bugs and fungus and things like that. So it's our crop. What are we going to do? We have to figure out how to manage it. Well, if you're in a place where, and grapevines are very susceptible to fungus. One of the things that with grapes is that we've kept the same varieties for hundreds of years. We don't breed them for it to change to a new variety that's fungal resistant. We keep the classic varieties, which, now that's changing. I think people are realizing we have to be able to breed new grapes. But for the meantime, how do you avoid over-treating the vineyard and the environment? And that, if you come to a place like Eastern Washington, we get 6 to 10 inches of precipitation a year, which is not very much at all. It's about the same as Las Vegas, which is it's a desert. And it's very low humidity. The humidity is very low, and because the winds are drying and we can control our moisture, we can limit the growth of the vine by cutting back on the water. So the vine is stressed and it grows sparsely. And when you do that, then it doesn't have high humidity in around the vine, and so it tends to it doesn't tend to have the kind of fungal pressure most other wine growing regions have. And that's why people spray sulfur on grapevines. In most areas. And we do have some fungal pressure, but it's less than or equal to the lowest in the world. So for that point of view, if you manage your vineyard properly, it takes less inputs in that regard. And we do, because we have drip irrigation, we don't necessarily have to spray. We don't have to do as many of the inputs as most other regions do. And it's possible to grow with very, very little inputs here compared to almost anywhere else in the world. So in that regard, wine grapes that grow in Eastern Washington, it's probably, in terms of inputs, one of the more sustainable areas and effect on the environment. And then in terms of water usage, grapevines are one of the most, if not the most, low usage crops that you can grow. And we use drip irrigation on top of that. So for that perspective, it is. Now, it's, and in terms of overall, assuming you want to have wine, the best thing is to not grow any grapes or anything. It's just to forage in your backyard. But if you're assuming you want a product, it is a very low input product, and in Washington State, probably one of the lowest. And in fact, most of our industry, the larger part of the industry, is mechanized on top of that. So that ends up being lower usage in terms of diesel and things like that. So it's actually quite an efficient system.
Is there pressure on the wine making, wine grape growing and wine making industries, community, on sustainability issues, like, oh, you got to do more, you need to do this or that? I know there's a lot of movements to push for more of that kind of stuff.
Well, yes, and I think a lot of it comes from the consumer and from concerned, businesses that realize that we need to make sure that what we're doing is sustainable. And I think there's a broadening perception amongst everybody that, this is not disposable. We can't use this and move on. I mean, if you go 20 miles south, or you go 40 miles south of here, it's not like there's another Yakima Valley down there where you can just plant new grapes. I mean, this is one of the great places in the world to grow wine grapes.
So it has to be maintained sustainably.
Yeah.
To not be lost.
Exactly. And so in that regard, what's interesting is there are systems that many regions have put in place that give sustainability guidelines. And what you find working in each area, though, is that the guidelines for California don't necessarily work in Washington. And the guidelines from the Willamette Valley don't necessarily work in the Napa Valley, because it's a different climate. You have different issues that are related to the geography and of the spot. And so, each region needs to make sure they're developing appropriate sustainability, guidelines.
You think that applies to a lot of the pressures in the food system, as far as people saying, oh, X product needs to be more sustainable? Well, what that looks like totally depends from region to region, even from farm to farm, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, for instance, if you're growing grapes on the west, say you're growing grapes in Utah, and your drainage is the Great Salt Lake, you don't necessarily have to be salmon safe in Utah, Yeah. Whereas here you do, because there's salmon out there. So it's so if salmon safe is one of your criteria, you just don't, and you called it, this is hypothetical.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to make someone in Utah do salmon safe winemaking, they may be doing something or using a product that they need to control some Utah pest that's not salmon friendly, so, but, and that's, I think what we find is that, as we address, each of these, we need to acknowledge that, that each region's different. And that's what's so great about having, Washington State University having a viticulture and enology department where we have researchers who understand our region.
Yeah.
And Oregon State in Oregon is doing the research down there, and UC Davis and Fresno State and all of you have to have a localized understanding in academia and professionals who can mold the sustainability to fit their region. And the cookie cutter approach is hard. It causes problems.
Yeah.
And everybody would like to think you can just take it from Oregon and put it into Washington, but they grow in a maritime, moderate and cool environment, and we grow in a desert, in a continental environment. It's completely different. It's apples and oranges, or apples and hazelnuts, so to speak. So you can't. Yeah. You just have to make sure that but within that statement, absolutely. That's where we all have to go. And the great news is that even conventional farming is getting better. I mean, it's so much better than it was even 15 years ago, and technology and things like that. So, for instance, one of the great things that was invented over the last 20 years was dealing with. We have these little worms these little caterpillars in the spring, and they'll climb up the post and nibble on the grapevines. And in the old days, they used to just nuke the whole vineyard with something, awful. And it was, you couldn't even go in the vineyard and to get rid of these caterpillars. And that was 20 years ago. And then the researchers realized, well, what we can do is set up an ATV with an electric eye, and we can spray capsaicin on the posts. And when the worm crawls up the grape post and hits the capsaicin, it burns its feet, and it turns around and goes back down.
Like the stuff that makes my hot sauce spicy?
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
So we went from having...
Like pepper spray for caterpillars.
And it doesn't even necessarily kill the caterpillars. It just prevents them from coming up and nibbling on the buds. And so those kind of things, that's just one tiny example. It was a very important one.
Yeah. But,
understanding the impact of beneficial insects. For instance, we found that some of the most beneficial, there are these little wasps that predate other insects, and you want them to stay alive. And so you don't want to do anything that's going to get rid of those wasps, because they do more control than any sprays would do. So, and we found that sagebrush harbors more of these by a factor of 10 than anything. I mean, we had people planting blackberries and planting things to harbor these insects. And then we found out, actually the sagebrush.
It's just kind of ubiquitous around here.
Yeah, you want to make sure, don't pull out the sagebrush. Keep it growing around your vineyard and things like that. So it's, as we learn more, we're able to react. It's more like jujitsu, You use the inertia that's already there to accomplish your goal. And so that's the real benefit. Now, if you counted on someone from UC Davis figuring out that sagebrush harbors beneficials, you'd be waiting 100 years. But
they don't have that.
They don't have it down there. So that's why we need our researchers up here. And so that's what's really, we've seen in the time I've been here, in the 25 years I've been here, that's, watching the development of irrigation, new and better irrigation, and better, plant health, plant material, detecting, viruses and getting rid of them, and figuring out how to cut back on the inputs. It's been immense since in just the last 25 years.
Having this tasting room here like this, you have such a direct touch point with consumers, unlike many others in the food and farming world do. What has that taught you? What do consumers care about right now? What are you hearing from people? What do they want to know about how you produce your wine?
Well, what I find is that there's for the people who come out here, there's a real hunger for learning about this area and what makes it unique, and the geology of it, and the climate, and all of these little things we're talking about. The funny thing is, because by the time someone comes out here, they don't just stumble in. They make an effort to get out here.
Right.
And all of the stuff that we're talking about today is stuff that they find fascinating. And they're curious about, why do you do this? Why did you do it here? Why do you live here? Well, part of why I live here is because I get up every morning and I stick my face out the window or the door, and I know if it's dry or windy or cold or hot, and how that affects that's important.
Yeah.
To me, when I'm making wine, is like, okay, how am I reacting and responding to where the grapes are? And I feel I do a better job by being here. And I try to get that across to the folks who come out here. But honestly, the people who make the effort to come out here are uniformly, curious, and they're kind of on a mission to find out this stuff. And
what about sustainability stuff? Do they ask about that too?
I think I don't necessarily hear as much as I don't hear as much about that as perhaps you might in Seattle. I think it's and it may be because they've driven 200 miles and burned 2 tanks of gas to get here. At some point it's they're on and they don't come that often. I mean, it's not like I have the same people coming over from Seattle every 2 weeks or something.
Right.
They're on they're kind of on it's almost like a wine safari. They've gone out into the wilds of eastern Washington, and they're going to bag some, see some wildlife and bag some great bottles. And it's an adventure, it's a vacation, and just like almost any other vacation. And so I try to, if they have questions, I try to give them at least same straight answers I can about them, and I think, the things I try to do that I feel people appreciate is that I use lightweight glass, because glass bottles are, melting the glass and shipping the glass and all of that is heavy, big bottles.
Yeah. Carbon footprint.
They increase your carbon footprint. So, and I typically use American-made products for everything. The caps I use, the labels I use, and the labels I use are made locally. I try to get glass that's produced, if not in Seattle, on the West Coast, California. I mean, they kind of tell me where they're producing the glass, but and it boils down to quality. And for me, I mean, since I use screw caps, they need to have a perfectly made bottle, and the quality control we get here is better than cheap glass from overseas. So it works for me, and it's more sustainable in my opinion, and it helps the economy here, which I mean, for all those reasons, and I think people see that I'm making an effort, is having a winery and producing tiny amounts of wine, is probably the best thing for carbon footprint is to have one giant winery that makes all the wine. Everyone else sit at home and have them, delivered in cans, and so there's a certain amount of carbon that's going to be made by having your own winery. And so I think, well, what can I do to mitigate that to the extent that I can, and still be able to have something special for people who want a naturally produced product from a local region that reflects what we do here and is part of the culture. So it's there's a trade-off everywhere, but I do whatever I can. And I'm, for me, I'm actually more, a lot of people, it's all about the romance. And I'm more of a pragmatic, practical person at heart. I know that I have good intentions about these things, but I try not to get lost in the romance of it all. And I approached a lot of it, so for instance, I don't use corks. I feel that the screw caps are better for the environment and in one regard, every bottle's good. Mm-hmm. You don't have to send when you send a bottle back, talk about a carbon footprint. The wine that you made is not good. The bottle is wasted. You have to go send it back or something like that. I mean, so what I say is every bottle's good when I make them. That saves me. That's a huge, if 2% of your bottles are bad because of the corks, or 1%, that's still unacceptable. I mean, the cost in carbon is huge there. So I'm like, honestly, using the screw cap is better for the environment because I don't waste any wine. And so I do think about these things, and I try to, if people are curious, I put a lot of thought into it, honestly.
Do you think people know what goes into making their food? Like all the work, all the background.
No. I don't think anyone thinks about that. I think very few people really think about it. The great thing is now you have YouTube, and you can pretty much go on and learn anything you want. If you're really curious, you can see it all,
Which YouTube video do you believe, though, and which one do you say, I'm not sure? Well,
I think you can, if a smart person, a perceptive person can weed through it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, most people have a good BS detector. If you grew up in this day and age, hopefully, and but you can see how things are done and made, and many times, and you can also watch videos from people who are, policing, that kind of things, and have concerns and have thought about it. So there's a lot of information out there, and I think more and more people are curious, but more and more people are disconnected from farming and their food, and it's, like we saw in the pandemic, no one thinks about it until it's gone from the shelf, and then we start going, wow, why isn't there this or that or the other? And then, I think, in my opinion, what's good for the environment and good for people's health and good for, sustainability is also ultimately, when we take all cost into consideration, economically beneficial. So, and I think a lot of the, especially our researchers and academics working in agriculture understand this, and they keep moving towards that. So, in fact, what's the healthiest way for people to farm? How do we mechanize it so people don't get injured picking apples? How do we avoid wasting food? Yeah. How do we grow things that require less inputs and chemicals? And how do we grow it? Whether that's how we irrigate it, how we the varieties we plant, where we plant things, where we don't plant things. Ultimately, there are people, lots of smart people, figuring out how to do this better and better. And I think they have to have a voice and to be heard, and to make sure that they're speaking with their legislators also. So, economic interests that are not necessarily sustainable aren't being, aren't winning the day if there's concerns. So, but I think there's a lot of that going on behind the scenes. I'm encouraged when I read and see the research and see the effects of the reduced inputs, like we're talking about with the little caterpillar. I mean, that was an amazing thing that made the environment better and cost less money at the same time. So, I mean, it's a win-win-win. And I think that's ultimately how the change is going to occur, when people see that the right thing to do is also the best way that sustains both them economically and environmentally as well.
Well, thanks for having me out to the winery here. This is so cool. I feel like we should do multiple episodes because there's so many more questions I want to ask you. So I may have to come back here.
Well, that'd be great, Dylan. This is fun. I mean, I love what you're doing here, and it's I think it's so important that people do know that the folks who are bringing them their food and wine and beverages are thinking about these things and are concerned and want what they want in many ways, which is a great place for all of us and all of our children to live in.
And yeah, I agree 100%. That's why we do this podcast, and hopefully we can help start to build some trust, because I think when we start trusting each other, then we can work together towards that ultimate goal that we all really want.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I do want to say, that what I do get from most of my consumers and customers, is they long for a feeling of authenticity and trust. And those are things you can't fake. And that's, the more of that we have, the more satisfied the customers are. And, there's enough marketing and inauthenticity out there. So I think there's a wide open market for authentic products and experiences for people. And I see that every day.
Well, thank you for doing that, providing that, and thanks again for having me.
You're welcome.
This is the Real Food, Real People podcast. These are the stories of the people who grow your food.